Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, one of the most influential figures in Japanese history, was born in 1884 in the small town of Nagaoka, Japan. His early life was shaped by Japan's swift modernization. By the time Yamamoto entered the Imperial Japanese Navy, the country had already begun its transformation into a military power, but it was also struggling with its own identity. His journey through Japan's Naval Academy, along with his subsequent studies abroad, set the stage for the leadership role he would later assume in World War II. Yamamoto's formative years as a naval officer exposed him to a variety of worldviews. He was sent to the United States as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. during the 1920s, where he studied the capabilities of the U.S. military firsthand. It was here that Yamamoto's profound respect for American power took root. He saw the U.S. as a growing industrial powerhouse capable of mobilizing vast resources for war. This experience, though invaluable, would also lead him to an unsettling conclusion. Japan could not sustain a long-term war against such a nation. This foresight informed his strategic decisions when he returned to Japan and rose through the ranks. Yamamoto's understanding of the American mindset and the nature of warfare would be crucial to his leadership during the Pacific War. When Japan's leaders decided to take a more aggressive stance, Yamamoto was appointed as the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet in 1939, just before the start of the Second World War. He was tasked with preparing the Imperial Navy for war, and it was his vision that shaped many of the early battles of the Pacific conflict. Yamamoto's most famous military operation was the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The strike was designed to cripple the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet and prevent American interference in Japan's expansion plans. The attack, though tactically successful, was strategically flawed. Yamamoto believed that by delivering a crushing blow to the U.S. Navy, Japan would gain time to fortify its holdings across the Pacific. However, he failed to anticipate the rallying power of American military machine and the United States' resilience to attack. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto struggled to reconcile the success of the attack with the broader implications of the war. He began to worry that Japan's resources were insufficient for a prolonged conflict, especially against an enemy with far greater industrial capabilities. As the war raged on, it became clear that Yamamoto's foresight was both his strength and his burden. He knew Japan could not win a long war against the U.S., but his duty demanded that he continue leading the charge. The reality of Japan's situation was highlighted during the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Yamamoto's plan to lure the U.S. Navy into a trap ended in disaster. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, a blow from which it would never fully recover. The battle proved that the U.S. was not only recovering from Pearl Harbor, but was adapting to the challenges Japan had set. This setback marked a turning point, and Yamamoto's confidence in his strategy began to falter. By 1943, Yamamoto was faced with the grim reality that Japan's naval power was diminishing. His earlier strategic brilliance was overshadowed by the changing tide of war, and his inability to foresee the full strength of American industrial mobilization made him question his own role in the conflict. Yet, despite these doubts, Yamamoto continued to advocate for aggressive tactics, hoping to push Japan's advantage before the United States could fully respond. Yamamoto's personal sense of duty and honor were intertwined with his understanding of the broader conflict. He recognized the risks inherent in his position as a high-ranking leader, but his commitment to Japan's war effort meant he could not shy away from danger. This internal conflict, along with his strategic miscalculations, would ultimately lead to his downfall. In this chapter, we explore the early life of Yamamoto, from his formative years in Japan to his eventual leadership role in the Pacific War. His experiences abroad, his understanding of the U.S., and his early military victories shaped his worldview and informed many of the decisions that would guide Japan's initial successes in the Pacific. However, as we'll see in later chapters, Yamamoto's strategic miscalculations and his inability to fully grasp the long-term nature of the conflict would set the stage for his tragic death. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's strategic vision for Japan during World War II was shaped by his keen understanding of naval warfare and his recognition of Japan's position in the larger global conflict. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Yamamoto was not driven solely by nationalistic fervor. His military decisions were guided by a pragmatic realization that Japan's future depended on securing its dominance in the Pacific before the United States could fully mobilize its industrial might. Yamamoto's primary concern was Japan's limited resources. The empire, despite its early military successes, was not self-sufficient, particularly in terms of essential materials like oil and rubber. These resources were crucial to sustaining Japan's war effort, but they were increasingly under threat from Allied forces. To secure these materials, Japan's leaders had envisioned an empire stretching from Southeast Asia to the South Pacific. But achieving this vision required eliminating the United States as a potential obstacle. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was the culmination of Yamamoto's strategy to neutralize American power in the Pacific. Yamamoto understood that a quick, decisive blow was necessary to buy Japan time to consolidate his empire. Pearl Harbor was supposed to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but more importantly, it was meant to demoralize the American people and delay any retaliatory action. The goal was not just to destroy ships and planes, but to force the U.S. into negotiations, buying Japan time to fortify its holdings in the Pacific. The attack was meticulously planned, with Yamamoto overseeing the operation from the shadows. The scale of the assault, coordinating 6 aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes, and a carefully planned timing, was a testament to Yamamoto's skill as a military tactician. However, there were key flaws in his plan that would soon become apparent. First, Yamamoto underestimated the ability of the United States to recover from such a devastating blow. He believed that the destruction of the Pacific Fleet would be enough to deter American involvement in the Pacific theater for the foreseeable future. But what Yamamoto failed to grasp was the sheer industrial capability of the U.S., which could replace the lost ships and aircraft at a pace far outstripping Japan's own manufacturing capacity. This strategic miscalculation would be the first of many. Secondly, Yamamoto did not anticipate the level of American resilience. The attack on Pearl Harbor, rather than breaking American morale, had the opposite effect. The United States, unified by the assault, quickly shifted into a war footing. Yamamoto himself had warned his superiors that Japan could not afford a long war with the United States. But in the wake of Pearl Harbor, Japan had effectively opened a Pandora's box. America's industrial might, fueled by its vast manufacturing capacity, would soon be unleashed in ways that Japan could not have predicted. Despite the early successes, Yamamoto's doubts about the war's long-term viability continued to haunt him. He was one of the few high-ranking military leaders who understood the gravity of Japan's situation. The Imperial Navy was at the height of its power, but Yamamoto knew that without quick, decisive victories, Japan would lose the ability to keep up with the industrial output of the United States. By mid-1942, these concerns began to manifest themselves during the Battle of Midway, a critical turning point in the Pacific War. Yamamoto's plan to lure the U.S. Navy into a trap failed catastrophically. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were lost, a blow that crippled Japan's naval ability to project force in the Pacific. Midway not only weakened Japan's position, but also showed the vulnerabilities of the Japanese fleet and its inability to match the United States' adaptability. The loss of 4 carriers at Midway was a devastating blow to Japan. These carriers had been the backbone of Japan's naval power, and their destruction marked the beginning of a shift in the balance of naval power in the Pacific. Yamamoto's leadership was called into question, and despite his tactical brilliance, Japan's position was becoming increasingly untenable. Yamamoto's miscalculations at Midway were not just tactical, but also strategic. By focusing too much on immediate, short-term goals, he had overlooked the broader context of the war. The United States, with its vast resources and industrial capacity, was able to replace its losses far faster than Japan could. As a result, Yamamoto's defeat at Midway marked the beginning of the end for Japan's ability to control the Pacific. Despite these setbacks, Yamamoto continued to advocate for bold strategies. In the face of mounting challenges, he urged Japan's leaders to take the fight to the U.S. Navy and continue pushing the boundaries of Japan's naval power. However, his calls for greater offensive action were tempered by his awareness that Japan was operating at a disadvantage. Yamamoto's dual nature, part visionary strategist, part fatalistic realist, became more pronounced as the war dragged on. By early 1943, it was clear that Japan's position in the war was weakening. While Yamamoto was still a respected figure within the Japanese military, his strategy was beginning to falter. The U.S. Navy, buoyed by technological advancements, intelligence breakthroughs, and an unrelenting industrial output, had gained the upper hand. For all of Yamamoto's early successes, the course of the war was shifting, and it was becoming more apparent that Japan's empire would be increasingly difficult to defend. As we will see in later chapters, Yamamoto's strategic miscalculations would not only cost Japan its naval supremacy, but would also lead to his personal downfall. His death in 1943 would be a turning point, not just for Japan's naval forces, but for the broader course of the war. However, his legacy, though marred by these miscalculations, would remain one of the most influential in the history of World War II. As the Pacific War unfolded, one of the most crucial factors in the eventual downfall of Japan's military might was the increasing effectiveness of American intelligence. While the Imperial Japanese Navy was still largely reliant on traditional tactics and strategies, the United States was rapidly developing capabilities that would allow them to stay one step ahead. The code-breaking efforts of American cryptographers in particular would have a profound impact on the war in the Pacific and play a decisive role in the events that led to the assassination of Admiral Yamamoto. The story of how the United States cracked Japanese military codes is a tale of ingenuity, patience, and sometimes sheer luck. Even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. had been monitoring Japanese communications. The key to understanding Japan's military plans, however, lay in deciphering the Imperial Japanese Navy's communications codes. These codes, which the Japanese believed to be unbreakable, would eventually be cracked by American codebreakers, providing the U.S. military with invaluable intelligence that would shift the balance of power in the Pacific. One of the most important breakthroughs came with the interception and decryption of a Japanese message known as JN-25, a cipher used to transmit naval communications. By late 1942, American cryptanalysts at the U.S. Navy's Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had succeeded in breaking parts of JN-25. This breakthrough gave the U.S. Navy insight into Japanese naval operations and the movements of key personnel, including Admiral Yamamoto. The significance of this intelligence cannot be overstated. In 1943, when Yamamoto was scheduled to travel to the Solomon Islands to inspect Japanese forces, American codebreakers were able to intercept the communication detailing his flight plan. This crucial piece of intelligence was a game changer. The United States now had the ability to track and predict Yamamoto's movements, and it was only a matter of time before the U.S. Navy would take action. The decision to act on this intelligence came from Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Nimitz, understanding the importance of Yamamoto as a military leader, realized that removing him from the battlefield could cripple Japan's morale and disrupt its strategic planning. As a result, Nimitz authorized an operation to intercept and kill Yamamoto, codenamed Operation Vengeance. The operation, which would be launched on April 18, 1943, aimed to destroy Yamamoto's aircraft as he flew between islands in the Solomon Islands. The mission was carried out with remarkable precision. A squadron of U.S. Army Air Force P-38 Lightning fighters was selected for the operation. These aircraft were the best suited for the mission due to their long range and ability to outmaneuver the slower Japanese aircraft. The pilots chosen for the mission had been briefed on the importance of the operation and understood that success would deal a devastating blow to Japan's military leadership. But the success of Operation Vengeance was not just the result of a carefully executed airstrike. The effectiveness of the American intelligence network was the true backbone of the mission. By intercepting Yamamoto's flight plan, the U.S. was able to assemble an attack that caught the Japanese by surprise. The critical role of code-breaking in this success underscores the evolving nature of warfare during World War II. As both sides adapted to the challenges of the war, intelligence became as important as military hardware, and in some cases, even more crucial. The assassination of Yamamoto was not only a military triumph, but also a psychological blow to the Japanese people and military. Yamamoto was one of the most respected leaders in Japan's armed forces. His death symbolized the vulnerability of Japan's military leadership, and it was a moment of profound impact on both sides of the war. The loss of Yamamoto also served to underline the growing importance of American intelligence in the Pacific. For Japan, the assassination of their most revered naval leader was a shock. Yamamoto's death was a devastating blow to Japan's morale. The admiral had been a symbol of Japan's early successes in the war and the backbone of its naval strategy. Without him, Japan's military leaders were left scrambling to fill the leadership void. Furthermore, Yamamoto had been instrumental in rallying the troops and maintaining a sense of confidence in the Japanese war effort. His death struck at the heart of Japan's naval leadership, undermining the resolve of many soldiers and commanders. In contrast, the United States saw Yamamoto's death as a major victory. Not only had they eliminated a key figure in Japan's military leadership, but they had done so using intelligence and precision. The successful execution of Operation Vengeance demonstrated the effectiveness of U.S. intelligence and military coordination. It was a morale-boosting victory that sent a powerful message to both the American people and the Japanese military. Yamamoto's death was a turning point in the Pacific War. It marked the end of an era of Japanese naval dominance, and while the war would continue for 2 more years, Japan's leadership structure was shaken. The success of the U.S. intelligence efforts also highlighted the changing nature of modern warfare. In a war that was increasingly defined by technological innovation and the ability to gather and act on information, intelligence operations had proven to be just as decisive as any battlefield victory. In the chapters that follow, we will explore the broader implications of Yamamoto's death on the Pacific War, examining how his assassination disrupted Japanese strategy and the morale of its forces. We will also delve into the legacy of American intelligence efforts during the war, highlighting the role that code-breaking played in the United States' ability to win key battles and ultimately emerge victorious in the Pacific. Yamamoto's death was just one chapter in a long and brutal conflict, but it remains a key moment in the history of World War II. The assassination of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, was not a random strike or a mere lucky shot. It was the result of months of meticulous planning, intelligence gathering, and careful coordination between U.S. military forces. The operation that led to Yamamoto's death, known as Operation Vengeance, was one of the most significant and daring missions of World War II, and it marked a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. The decision to target Yamamoto came directly from Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. After the successful decryption of Japanese communications, Nimitz and his staff learned that Yamamoto would be flying on a mission to the Solomon Islands on April 18th. The U.S. had successfully intercepted the Japanese message detailing the admiral's itinerary, providing them with the perfect opportunity to strike. Yamamoto was scheduled to travel from Rabaul, a key Japanese stronghold in the Pacific, to the islands of Bougainville and Guadalcanal. The timing of this trip was critical. It was to inspect Japanese forces in the region and rally morale. For the Americans, this presented a unique opportunity. Yamamoto was one of Japan's most prominent military leaders, and his death would be a severe blow to Japan's morale and military operations. The mission was a daunting one. To reach Yamamoto, the U.S. pilots would need to fly over 400 miles into enemy territory, avoiding radar detection and encountering the potential threat of Japanese fighter planes and anti-aircraft defenses. The attackers would also need to arrive at the exact time and location of Yamamoto's flight. Timing and precision were essential for the success of the mission. Admiral Nimitz chose a squadron of P-38 Lightning fighters to carry out the operation. The P-38 was selected because of its impressive range and speed, making it the ideal choice for such a long-range strike. These aircraft had the ability to reach the target area without refueling, and their twin-engine design made them particularly suited for the mission's high-risk profile. The pilots chosen for the operation were carefully selected based on their experience and ability to carry out precision strikes. They understood the importance of the mission. They weren't simply flying to engage in air combat, but to eliminate one of the most significant figures in the Japanese military. The U.S. forces had a critical advantage: the intelligence gathered from decoded Japanese communications. As a result, they were able to pinpoint the exact flight path of Yamamoto's aircraft. This information provided the American pilots with the perfect window of opportunity. The mission would be executed with precision, and every element of the attack had been carefully planned. As the squadron of P-38 fighters took off from their base in the Solomon Islands, they followed a carefully charted route. The flight was long and dangerous, with the pilots flying at low altitude to avoid radar detection. The air was thick with tension. The mission was risky, and failure would mean not only the loss of valuable aircraft, but also a significant blow to the morale of the U.S. forces. Despite the challenges, the pilots remained focused and determined. As they neared the target, they knew that they were about to enter one of the most dangerous areas in the Pacific. Yamamoto's fleet of aircraft would likely be accompanied by a number of Japanese fighters, and the Americans would need to strike swiftly and decisively to ensure the mission's success. At the designated time, the squadron arrived at the target area. As they began their descent, they spotted Yamamoto's aircraft flanked by a small number of Japanese fighters. The American pilots knew they had only a narrow window of time to strike. With expert precision, they pounced on the Japanese aircraft, diving in from above. The attack was swift. The P-38 pilots, having trained for this moment, engaged Yamamoto's plane with devastating accuracy. A few well-placed shots brought down Yamamoto's aircraft, and it crashed into the jungle below. The American pilots had succeeded in their mission, eliminating the man who had been the mastermind behind Japan's early victories in the Pacific. For the U.S. forces, this was a critical victory. The death of Yamamoto struck at the heart of Japan's military leadership. He was not just a commander, but a symbol of Japan's naval power, and his loss sent shockwaves throughout the Japanese military. Yamamoto had been deeply respected within Japan, both as a military strategist and as a leader, and his loss undermined Japan's sense of invincibility. Yamamoto's assassination also had significant strategic implications. His death deprived Japan of a key decision-maker at a time when the Pacific War was turning in favor of the Allies. Japan's military leaders, already facing setbacks in battles like Midway and Guadalcanal, were now left without their most influential voice in the naval war. Yamamoto's leadership had been a unifying force within the Imperial Navy, and his loss would leave a void that Japan's remaining commanders struggled to fill. While the immediate impact of Yamamoto's death was felt most acutely within Japan, it also had a lasting effect on the Pacific theater. The U.S. military had demonstrated its ability to track and target the most high-profile figures in the Japanese military with precision. This success reinforced the growing sense that the tide of the war was shifting in favor of the Allies. The success of Operation Vengeance also highlighted the evolving nature of modern warfare, where intelligence, precision, and technology played as critical a role as brute force.
The ability to decode enemy communications, track movements, and execute a strike with pinpoint accuracy demonstrated the growing dominance of the U.S. military in the Pacific. For the Japanese, the assassination of Yamamoto marked a painful reminder of their vulnerability, and it would prove to be a pivotal moment in the Pacific War.
The assassination of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, sent shockwaves through the Imperial Japanese Navy and the broader Japanese military. News of his death reached Tokyo with startling speed, and the reaction from Japan's military and political leadership was one of profound disbelief and shock. Yamamoto was not just a military commander, he was a symbol of Japan's naval power and a revered figure within the empire. The loss of such a key leader would have deep and far-reaching consequences for Japan's war effort. Yamamoto's death was particularly devastating for Japan's morale. Having led the Imperial Navy through its early triumphs in the Pacific, including the successful attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had come to embody the resilience and strength of Japan's military might. His leadership, strategic brilliance, and experience were considered irreplaceable, and his absence left a major gap in the ranks of the Japanese military. The immediate reaction in Japan was a mixture of shock, grief, and confusion. The Japanese people had been told little about the specifics of the war and the true state of Japan's fortunes, which were beginning to deteriorate. Yamamoto's death exposed the vulnerability of Japan's leadership at a critical juncture in the war. The Japanese military had relied heavily on Yamamoto's expertise, particularly in naval strategy. His vision for Japan's expansion across the Pacific had been a driving force behind the country's early successes. Without him, Japan's military command was left uncertain about how to continue the war. While his death did not immediately alter Japan's capacity to wage war, it undermined the cohesiveness of its military leadership and presented a psychological blow to Japan's armed forces. In the days following the assassination, Japanese military leaders scrambled to fill the void left by Yamamoto's absence. However, no one could match his stature or influence. Admiral Minichi Koga was appointed as the new commander of the combined fleet, but he lacked the experience and vision that had made Yamamoto such a formidable figure. Koga's leadership would struggle to match the strategic brilliance of his predecessor, and Japan's naval fortunes would continue to decline. Beyond the immediate leadership vacuum, Yamamoto's death had a broader psychological effect on Japan's military. The Japanese had been trained to believe in the invincibility of their navy and the superiority of their military strategy. Yamamoto was not only a commander, but a symbol of that invincibility. His sudden death at the hands of the American military shattered the illusion that Japan's military leadership was untouchable. In Japan, the death of their admiral prompted calls for retaliation, and a renewed sense of urgency gripped the Imperial Army and Navy. The country's military leaders was determined to take revenge for Yamamoto's assassination, but there was little they could do to change the course of the war. Japan had already suffered significant setbacks in key battles such as Midway and Guadalcanal, and the tide of the war was shifting in favor of the United States. For the Japanese government, Yamamoto's death posed a significant challenge. It was not just the loss of a key military leader, but the loss of a symbol of Japan's naval dominance. The attack had been carried out with precision and professionalism, showing the Japanese that their enemies were capable of targeting their most important figures. This created a sense of vulnerability within the Japanese high command that they had not felt before. The U.S. attack on Yamamoto was also a clear message to the Japanese leadership. Their communications were no longer secure, and the U.S. was capable of tracking and targeting high-value leaders with devastating effect. This realization would have a profound impact on Japan's strategic thinking in the months and years to come. Japan would continue to rely on its military prowess, but the loss of its top naval commander highlighted the limitations of Japanese intelligence and the vulnerability of its leadership. The psychological impact of Yamamoto's death was felt not just in Japan, but also by the Allies.
For the United States, the operation was seen as a huge victory. It demonstrated that American intelligence and military coordination were increasingly effective and could successfully target the highest levels of enemy leadership. The United States' ability to strike at such a prominent figure sent a powerful message to the Japanese: no one was safe. For Japan, however, the death of Yamamoto was the beginning of a series of losses that would define the later stages of the Pacific War. Although the Japanese military would continue to fight valiantly in the Pacific, Yamamoto's absence contributed to Japan's inability to recover from its early defeats. His death did not mark the end of Japan's fighting capability, but it was the beginning of a steady decline in the country's naval power. The loss of Yamamoto also had a profound effect on Japan's relationship with its allies. Germany, Japan's primary Axis partner, had admired Yamamoto as a brilliant strategist and a powerful leader. His death was a blow to Japan's standing in the eyes of its partners and signaled that the once unbeatable Japanese military was now vulnerable. The Axis powers were no longer as united as they had been, and their eventual defeat seemed more likely. On the battlefield, Yamamoto's death would be felt in a very tangible way. As the United States continued its island-hopping campaign, Japan's ability to defend its territories was severely weakened. The loss of experienced pilots and naval commanders, combined with dwindling resources, further compounded Japan's struggles. Yamamoto had been one of the primary architects of Japan's initial strategy, and with his death, Japan lost not just a key commander, but a central figure who had believed in the importance of decisive victories. Despite the loss of its most significant naval leader, Japan would continue the war for 2 more years. However, the death of Yamamoto marked a significant shift in Japan's ability to maintain its position in the Pacific. While Japan would continue to fight fiercely, the morale of its people and its military would slowly erode in the face of mounting losses. The loss of Yamamoto also had a profound effect on Japan's relationship with its allies. Germany, Japan's primary Axis partner, had admired Yamamoto as a brilliant strategist and a powerful leader. His death was a blow to Japan's standing in the eyes of its partners and signaled that the once unbeatable Japanese military was now vulnerable. The Axis powers were no longer as united as they had been, and their eventual defeat seemed more likely. On the battlefield, Yamamoto's death would be felt in a very tangible way. As the United States continued its island-hopping campaign, Japan's ability to defend its territories was severely weakened. The loss of experienced pilots and naval commanders, combined with dwindling resources, further compounded Japan's struggles. Yamamoto had been one of the primary architects of Japan's initial strategy, and with his death, Japan lost not just a key commander, but a central figure who had believed in the importance of decisive victories. Despite the loss of its most significant naval leader, Japan would continue the war for 2 more years. However, the death of Yamamoto marked a significant shift in Japan's ability to maintain its position in the Pacific. While Japan would continue to fight fiercely, the morale of its people and its military would slowly erode in the face of mounting losses.
The death of Admiral Yamamoto in April 1943 had far-reaching psychological and strategic consequences for Japan. Yamamoto was not only a respected military commander, but a symbol of Japan's early successes in the Pacific. His leadership had played a crucial role in orchestrating key victories, including the attack on Pearl Harbor and the early successes at sea. The loss of such a figure caused a profound shift in the Japanese military's outlook, leaving both its leadership and its soldiers to grapple with uncertainty. One of the most immediate effects of Yamamoto's death was the blow it dealt to Japan's morale. The admiral had been seen as invincible, a leader who had orchestrated victories that had propelled Japan into a position of strength at the beginning of the war. To the Japanese people and military, Yamamoto's leadership was synonymous with Japan's naval power. His assassination shattered this image, and the loss of such a towering figure in the Navy made many question Japan's ability to continue the war. Yamamoto's death also exposed a deeper vulnerability within the Japanese military, its reliance on individual leaders. While Japan's officers were highly trained and respected, the loss of a central figure like Yamamoto revealed a lack of succession planning within the Imperial Navy. His absence created a leadership vacuum, and the commanders who succeeded him lacked both his vision and his strategic foresight. Admiral Miniichi Koga, Yamamoto's replacement, was seen as competent but lacked the charisma and strategic brilliance of his predecessor. Japan's military leadership, once a well-oiled machine, was now thrown into disarray. Koga's appointment did little to stabilize the situation. While he was a capable officer, he was burdened with the task of rebuilding Japan's naval power at a time when Japan's resources were rapidly depleting. The loss of Yamamoto left a profound strategic gap, and Koga's inability to fill it meant that Japan's naval strategy would be less coordinated and more reactive in the coming months. In addition to the leadership vacuum, Japan faced severe resource shortages. The war had stretched the nation's resources thin, and its ability to sustain large-scale operations in the Pacific was increasingly under threat. The United States' growing industrial power was now fully engaged in the conflict, and Japan's ability to keep up was becoming increasingly difficult. Yamamoto had been keenly aware of Japan's limited resources and had often warned his superiors about the need to strike decisively before the United States could fully mobilize. His death now left Japan without a clear voice of caution, and the country's leadership was left struggling to adapt to the evolving war. As the war dragged on, the Japanese military's inability to replace Yamamoto's leadership became evident. The loss of experienced naval commanders, along with the depletion of trained pilots, further hindered Japan's ability to wage effective naval warfare. The Battle of Midway, which had been a devastating defeat, and the subsequent losses at Guadalcanal and other islands were clear signs that Japan's strategic position in the Pacific was deteriorating. Yamamoto had understood the importance of maintaining Japan's naval superiority. His vision of a swift, decisive war in the Pacific was rooted in his belief that Japan needed to establish dominance early on, before the United States could fully respond. But as the war progressed and Japan's resources became more strained, his strategy began to show cracks. With his death, the Imperial Navy found itself increasingly unable to maintain the aggressive stance that Yamamoto had championed. Japan's naval forces were being pushed back, and the Allies were making steady progress across the Pacific. The shift in Japan's strategy after Yamamoto's death was marked by a series of defensive measures. Japan's leadership, unable to mount the same level of offensive operations, focused on consolidating their positions and fortifying key islands. However, this defensive posture did little to stem the tide of American advances. The United States island hopping campaign, which targeted strategically important islands and bypassed others, continued to chip away at Japan's hold on the Pacific. The psychological toll on the Japanese military was immense. Yamamoto had been a leader who embodied the ideals of the Imperial Navy: courage, precision, and honor. His death served as a reminder of Japan's vulnerability. As the war dragged on, the Japanese military struggled to maintain morale, and many soldiers began to question the feasibility of their ultimate victory. Despite their loyalty to the emperor and their sense of duty, the reality of Japan's dwindling resources and the relentless advance of Allied forces weighed heavily on the minds of the Japanese military. On the home front, the Japanese government sought to rally the people by portraying Yamamoto's death as a necessary sacrifice. Propaganda was used to convince the population that the war was still winnable and that Japan would continue to fight to the bitter end. However, as the war stretched into its third year, the Japanese people began to feel the weight of mounting losses. The death of Yamamoto had not only weakened Japan's military leadership, but also diminished the morale of the civilian population, who were increasingly affected by the hardships of war. Despite these challenges, Japan's resolve did not immediately falter. The country continued to fight fiercely, launching counterattacks in the Pacific and mobilizing all available resources for the war effort. However, the death of Yamamoto marked a turning point in Japan's ability to wage war. The United States, with its superior industrial capabilities and growing strategic advantage, continued to press forward, and Japan's position in the Pacific steadily weakened. Yamamoto's death also had far-reaching consequences on Japan's relationship with its Axis allies. The Germans, who had long admired Yamamoto's strategic acumen, recognized the significance of his loss. Germany had placed great stock in Japan's military prowess, and the death of its top naval commander sent a clear signal that Japan was vulnerable. While the Axis powers continued to cooperate, the loss of Yamamoto was a clear indicator that Japan's once dominant military was now in decline. In the wake of Admiral Yamamoto's assassination, Japan's naval strategy underwent a significant transformation. The loss of such a strategic mastermind left a leadership void that would deeply affect Japan's military planning. While Yamamoto had envisioned a war of rapid, decisive strikes, his death marked the beginning of a shift toward a more defensive posture. This shift, however, was not enough to stem the tide of Allied advances. Before his death, Yamamoto's strategies were rooted in the belief that Japan needed to strike hard and fast to secure dominance in the Pacific. He had championed the idea of maintaining naval superiority and securing critical resources across the region. His plan, especially after the successful attack on Pearl Harbor, was to maintain an offensive posture, using Japan's naval power to push American forces out of the Pacific and cripple their ability to respond. Yamamoto understood that Japan's geographical position and limited resources made a protracted war against the United States unsustainable. The longer the war dragged on, the more difficult it would be for Japan to maintain its empire. His strategy, therefore, relied on quick victories that would force the United States into peace negotiations before the full power of American industrial might could be unleashed. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a bold attempt to achieve just that: cripple the U.S. Navy and gain the upper hand in the Pacific early in the war. However, following Yamamoto's death, Japan found itself at a crossroads. The Japanese Navy could no longer afford to maintain the aggressive, offensive strategy that had been the hallmark of Yamamoto's leadership. Admiral Minichi Koga, Yamamoto's successor, adopted a more cautious approach, opting for a defensive strategy that focused on holding the territories Japan had already seized. The emphasis shifted to fortifying key islands and preparing for a drawn-out war of attrition. While Koga's approach might have been pragmatic, it was also an acknowledgement of Japan's limitations. The Imperial Navy had suffered heavy losses at Midway and Guadalcanal, and resources were stretched thin. Yamamoto's death made it clear to Japan's leaders that they could no longer hope for quick, decisive victories against the United States. Japan's naval forces, once a dominating force in the Pacific, were now on the defensive. The shift to a defensive strategy was not a choice. It was a necessity, driven by Japan's inability to sustain a long-term war with the United States. The decision to move toward a defensive strategy, however, had significant consequences for Japan. Instead of taking the war to the United States, Japan now found itself trying to hold on to the territories it had seized. Islands across the Pacific became key strategic points in a war of attrition. As the Allies launched their island hopping campaign, Japan's ability to defend these critical outposts was weakened. The U.S. Army and Navy, meanwhile, were able to bypass heavily fortified islands and strike at the heart of Japan's empire. Japan's inability to mount effective counterattacks also became evident. The Japanese Navy, once the pride of the Imperial forces, was increasingly unable to keep pace with the advances of the U.S. Navy. The loss of experienced commanders, pilots, and aircraft took its toll, and Japan struggled to replace its losses at the same rate the United States could. While Koga and other commanders did their best to keep the Imperial Navy afloat, the loss of Yamamoto's strategic vision left them floundering. In the wake of Yamamoto's death, Japan's military strategy also suffered from a lack of coordination between the Army and the Navy. Under Yamamoto, there had been a more unified approach to military operations, with both branches working together toward common goals. After his death, however, the Japanese military was less unified, with the Army and Navy often pursuing separate strategies.
This lack of coordination made it more difficult for Japan to respond to Allied advances effectively. The defensive strategy that Japan adopted after Yamamoto's death also reflected a broader shift in the war's dynamics. Japan had initially hoped to dominate the Pacific and force the United States to negotiate a peace settlement. But as the war continued, it became increasingly clear that Japan's position was deteriorating. The Allies, bolstered by their industrial power and expanding military capabilities, were moving relentlessly toward Japan's home islands. Japan's once formidable naval forces were now on the back foot, trying to defend an empire that was increasingly out of reach. One of the most telling consequences of Japan's strategic shift was the loss of its carrier forces. The Japanese Navy had relied heavily on aircraft carriers as the backbone of its naval power, and Yamamoto had been a strong proponent of using carriers to project power. But after Midway and other battles, Japan's carrier fleet had been severely depleted. Koga's defensive strategy could not replace these losses, and Japan's naval capacity was significantly reduced. This shift in strategy had another important consequence. The Japanese military's ability to adapt to changing circumstances became increasingly limited. The United States, on the other hand, was able to leverage its growing technological and industrial capabilities to build an ever larger fleet. American aircraft carriers, submarines, and bombers were being mass-produced at a pace Japan could not match. While Japan continued to fight valiantly, it was clear that the tide of the war had turned in favor of the United States. As the war progressed, Japan's strategic focus shifted from offensive operations to survival. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, often referred to as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was a devastating defeat for the Japanese Navy. In this battle, Japan lost nearly all of its remaining carrier aircraft, further undermining its ability to wage effective naval warfare. The loss of these carriers and their aircrews dealt a crushing blow to Japan's naval strategy. In the aftermath of these defeats, Japan's military leadership was forced to confront the reality that the war was no longer winnable. Despite their best efforts to defend their empire, the Japanese Navy could no longer match the power and resources of the United States. The shift from an aggressive offensive strategy to a defensive one had been a tactical necessity, but it was a sign of Japan's shrinking options and the growing dominance of the United States in the Pacific. One of the most telling consequences of Japan's strategic shift was the loss of its carrier forces. The Japanese Navy had relied heavily on aircraft carriers as the backbone of its naval power, and Yamamoto had been a strong proponent of using carriers to project power. But after Midway and other battles, Japan's carrier fleet had been severely depleted. Koga's defensive strategy could not replace these losses, and Japan's naval capacity was significantly reduced. This shift in strategy had another important consequence. The Japanese military's ability to adapt to changing circumstances became increasingly limited. The United States, on the other hand, was able to leverage its growing technological and industrial capabilities to build an ever larger fleet. American aircraft carriers, submarines, and bombers were being mass-produced at a pace Japan could not match. While Japan continued to fight valiantly, it was clear that the tide of the war had turned in favor of the United States. As the war progressed, Japan's strategic focus shifted from offensive operations to survival. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, often referred to as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was a devastating defeat for the Japanese Navy. In this battle, Japan lost nearly all of its remaining carrier aircraft, further undermining its ability to wage effective naval warfare. The loss of these carriers and their aircrews dealt a crushing blow to Japan's naval strategy. In the aftermath of these defeats, Japan's military leadership was forced to confront the reality that the war was no longer winnable. Despite their best efforts to defend their empire, the Japanese Navy could no longer match the power and resources of the United States. The shift from an aggressive offensive strategy to a defensive one had been a tactical necessity, but it was a sign of Japan's shrinking options and the growing dominance of the United States in the Pacific.
One of the most decisive factors that contributed to the ultimate success of the United States in the Pacific War was the pivotal role played by American intelligence. While conventional military power, such as aircraft carriers, submarines, and naval fleets, were essential to the Allies' success, it was intelligence, gathered through code-breaking, espionage, and careful analysis, that allowed the U.S. to anticipate and counter Japanese moves. In many ways, the rise of intelligence as a central element of military strategy marked a turning point in modern warfare. The backbone of American intelligence during World War II was the ability to intercept and decrypt Japanese communications. Early in the war, the U.S. Army and Navy had made limited progress in cracking the Japanese military codes, but by 1942, significant breakthroughs had been made. These breakthroughs, especially in the decryption of the Japanese JN-25 code used by the Navy, allowed U.S. forces to gain a crucial advantage over their adversaries. By the time of Yamamoto's assassination in April 1943, American cryptanalysts had successfully cracked much of the Japanese code, allowing them to intercept critical messages. This success was largely due to the efforts of a dedicated team of codebreakers, particularly those at Station Hypo in Hawaii. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, the team worked tirelessly to decipher Japanese military communications. Their efforts provided U.S. military leaders with valuable insights into Japanese strategies and allowed them to act with precision, as evidenced by the successful targeting of Admiral Yamamoto. The ability to intercept and decode enemy communications was a game-changer. Before the success of the U.S. codebreakers, the Japanese had assumed that their messages were unbreakable. This false sense of security allowed them to discuss sensitive military operations and movements without fear of interception. Once the U.S. codebreakers cracked the Japanese codes, however, the balance of power shifted. The most famous example of the importance of intelligence came during the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Prior to this battle, U.S. Navy intelligence had intercepted Japanese messages indicating that an attack on Midway Island was imminent. Armed with this knowledge, U.S. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz was able to deploy his forces strategically, setting a trap for the Japanese fleet. The result was a decisive American victory, with the U.S. sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, a devastating blow to the Japanese Navy. The success at Midway, fueled by intelligence, was one of the first major turning points in the Pacific War. It marked the beginning of a shift in momentum toward the United States. It also illustrated the importance of code-breaking, as the ability to predict Japanese actions and counter them effectively gave the U.S. an edge that would prove invaluable in subsequent battles. The intelligence gleaned from code-breaking did not only affect large-scale battles. It also played a key role in individual operations, such as Operation Vengeance, the mission to kill Admiral Yamamoto. By intercepting Japanese communications detailing Yamamoto's flight plans, U.S. intelligence was able to provide an exact window for the attack. This precision allowed American pilots to carry out the operation with unmatched accuracy, ultimately leading to Yamamoto's death. While the Japanese military underestimated the capabilities of U.S. intelligence, American officials fully understood the power of their new advantage. By the spring of 1943, U.S. cryptanalysts had decoded enough of the Japanese messages to track not only military operations, but also the movements of key figures. This intelligence-gathering network allowed the United States to track and target Japan's most influential leaders and military commanders. The U.S. also gained intelligence through other means, including espionage and human intelligence. One of the most well-known examples of this is the work of spies in the Pacific Theater who provided valuable information about Japanese troop movements, ship locations, and other critical assets. Although not as widely discussed as code-breaking, human intelligence operations were vital to the success of the U.S. war effort. The importance of intelligence operations extended beyond the military. The United States' ability to decode Japanese communications also provided crucial insights into the Japanese leadership's mindset. For example, after Yamamoto's assassination, American intelligence learned that his death had a profound psychological impact on Japanese high command.
The Japanese leadership, once confident and insulated, now realized that their communications were vulnerable, and that no one, no matter how powerful, was safe from U.S. strikes. Intelligence played a crucial role in other key battles as well, including the Solomon Islands campaign, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and the eventual invasion of Japan's home islands. Through intercepted communications and other intelligence methods, the U.S. was able to gather vital information that allowed for the successful amphibious assaults and air raids on Japanese strongholds. It is also worth noting the role of deception in U.S. intelligence efforts. The Allies were not only decoding Japanese communications, but also feeding misinformation back into Japanese channels. This strategy, known as deception operations or counterintelligence, was used to mislead the Japanese and confuse their decision-making process. A notable example of this is Operation Bodyguard, which was designed to deceive the Germans about the D-Day landings in Europe. While this operation occurred in the European theater, it demonstrated how intelligence could be used not just to gather information, but to manipulate enemy actions. The American success in intelligence gathering during World War II was also the result of advancements in technology. The development of more advanced computing machines, such as the Bombay machine used to decipher German Enigma codes, and the increase in radio surveillance, gave the U.S. the technological edge needed to stay ahead of Japan and Germany. These breakthroughs were critical in making the intelligence operations more effective, as they allowed for faster decryption of intercepted messages and more reliable sources of information. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of the U.S. intelligence effort during World War II was its ability to anticipate Japanese actions. The success of U.S. military strategy in the Pacific was largely based on this capacity to predict rather than react. The intelligence operations allowed U.S. commanders to be proactive, targeting high-value Japanese leaders like Yamamoto before they could strike, and disrupting Japanese military operations at their core. By the end of the war, the role of intelligence had proven to be indispensable. The United States' ability to gain and act on critical information transformed the way wars would be fought in the future. The legacy of the intelligence breakthroughs of World War II set the stage for the Cold War, where espionage and covert operations became the cornerstone of superpower competition. The lessons learned from the Pacific War still influence military strategy today, highlighting the importance of information warfare in modern conflict.
The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4 to June 7, 1942, is considered one of the most decisive engagements of World War II. It was the battle that turned the tide of the Pacific War in favor of the United States, dealing a devastating blow to the Japanese Navy. For Japan, it marked the beginning of a prolonged retreat across the Pacific, while for the United States, it was a critical victory that halted Japanese expansion and set the stage for subsequent Allied successes. The origins of the Battle of Midway lie in Japan's expansionist ambitions. By the spring of 1942, Japan had already secured a vast swath of territory across the Pacific, from Southeast Asia to the Central Pacific. Following their successful attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan sought to consolidate its gains by capturing the Midway Islands, a small but strategically significant U.S. outpost located approximately halfway between Asia and North America. For the Japanese, Midway represented a key stepping stone in their plan to dominate the Pacific. By securing the islands, they would extend their defensive perimeter, preventing U.S. forces from staging a counterattack. The Japanese High Command, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, believed that a decisive naval battle at Midway would eliminate the remaining American naval presence in the Pacific, cementing Japan's control over the region. However, Japan's plan was based on a critical assumption that the United States would be unable to respond effectively to an attack on Midway. At the time, Japan had considerable naval superiority, and the U.S. Navy was still recovering from the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet, the United States had one decisive advantage: intelligence. As discussed in the previous chapters, American cryptanalysts had successfully cracked the Japanese JN-25 code, which gave U.S. forces insight into Japanese military plans.
Through this breakthrough, the U.S. learned of Japan's plans to attack Midway. Armed with this critical information, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was able to prepare for the battle in a way that would have been impossible without this intelligence. The U.S. Navy's ability to anticipate the Japanese attack was a game-changer. With the element of surprise on their side, the United States was able to set a trap for the Japanese fleet. Nimitz positioned his carriers and other naval forces strategically, allowing them to be in the right place at the right time. This preparation was instrumental in ensuring that when the Japanese struck, they were met with fierce resistance. The battle itself was marked by high-stakes naval combat and the effective use of air power. The Japanese launched a massive air attack on Midway Island, but the U.S. Navy had already prepared a counteroffensive. American bombers and torpedo planes launched from the carriers USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown made several waves of attacks on the Japanese fleet. The turning point in the battle came when American bombers, guided by intelligence and timing, located the Japanese carrier fleet. In a series of daring attacks, U.S. bombers managed to sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These carriers were the backbone of Japan's naval power, and their loss represented a catastrophic blow to the Japanese Navy. The loss of these carriers had far-reaching consequences for Japan's naval capabilities. Aircraft carriers were the cornerstone of modern naval warfare, and Japan's carrier fleet had been the pride of the Imperial Navy. With their loss, Japan was unable to effectively project naval power in the Pacific, and the balance of power began to shift. In contrast, the United States was able to replace its losses more quickly, thanks to its industrial capabilities and efficient military production. The battle also highlighted the increasing effectiveness of American tactics and technology. While Japan's military commanders were still relying on traditional naval warfare strategies, the U.S. Navy was adapting to the new realities of the Pacific conflict. The use of aircraft carriers, long-range bombers, and the integration of air and naval operations proved to be a decisive advantage for the United States. For the United States, the victory at Midway was a major morale boost. After the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, Americans had been desperate for a win. Midway provided that, and it gave the U.S. military the confidence it needed to continue its efforts in the Pacific. The battle demonstrated that the U.S. was no longer on the defensive, but had the ability to take the fight to the Japanese. In Japan, the reaction to the defeat at Midway was one of disbelief and shock. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers was a blow to Japan's naval power that it could not easily recover from. While the Japanese Navy continued to fight valiantly, the battle marked the beginning of a series of defeats that would culminate in Japan's eventual surrender in 1945. The Battle of Midway had significant strategic consequences. Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations in the Pacific was severely hindered, and the United States began to take the initiative. Midway shifted the balance of naval power in favor of the Allies, and it marked the start of the U.S. Navy's island-hopping campaign. The battle set the stage for a series of key victories, including the capture of Guadalcanal and eventually the invasion of Japan's home islands. Midway also demonstrated the critical role of intelligence in modern warfare. The U.S. Navy's success in the battle was in no small part due to the ability to decode Japanese messages and prepare a response. Intelligence, once seen as a secondary concern in warfare, was now a central element of military strategy, shaping the outcome of key battles and ultimately the course of the war.
After the devastating defeat at the Battle of Midway, the Japanese Imperial Navy began a slow, inexorable decline. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers, along with hundreds of experienced pilots, was a blow from which Japan's naval forces would never fully recover. The battle, combined with the mounting pressure of the Allied island-hopping campaign, exposed the vulnerabilities of Japan's once mighty naval power. At the start of World War II, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been one of the most formidable maritime forces in the world.
It had dominated the Pacific Ocean, achieving rapid victories and overwhelming American and Allied forces in the early stages of the war. However, Japan's naval superiority was based on a series of assumptions that would soon prove fatal. The belief that Japan could achieve a quick, decisive victory before the United States had time to fully mobilize, and the overconfidence in their naval capabilities. The victory at Pearl Harbor had confirmed Japan's belief in the invincibility of their naval forces, but it also triggered the mobilization of American industrial power. By 1942, the United States had ramped up its production of warships, aircraft, and other military hardware. The United States' industrial capacity was unlike any other, and this soon became evident as Japan's Navy began to lose ships and experienced personnel at a devastating rate. The Battle of Midway was the first major blow to Japan's dominance in the Pacific, but it was far from the last. Following the loss of the 4 carriers at Midway, Japan struggled to replace its most advanced ships and aircraft. The Allies were able to build and deploy new ships and planes at a pace that Japan simply could not match. By 1943, Japan's naval leadership was grappling with the realization that their empire could not sustain its momentum, and they began to abandon offensive operations in favor of a defensive strategy. The Japanese Navy's inability to replace their losses in carriers, planes, and pilots was one of the most significant factors in their decline. The United States' ability to rapidly produce new aircraft and warships, particularly aircraft carriers and submarines, put Japan at a serious disadvantage. While the United States could replace its losses, Japan struggled to maintain the manpower and resources needed to continue a prolonged war. In addition to the technological and logistical challenges, the Japanese Navy also faced growing difficulties in terms of leadership. After the death of Admiral Yamamoto, Japan's naval leadership was thrown into disarray. The loss of the strategic vision and leadership that Yamamoto had provided was keenly felt. His successors, like Admiral Mineichi Koga, were competent but lacked the charisma and strategic insight of their predecessor. Admiral Koga, who took over after Yamamoto's death, attempted to shore up the Japanese Navy's defenses by focusing on creating stronger defensive positions on the islands Japan had captured. His strategy was rooted in the belief that Japan could withstand the American advance and hold on to key positions. However, this defensive posture proved ineffective as the United States' naval superiority continued to grow. The Allies' ability to bypass heavily fortified islands and target critical Japanese positions undermined Koga's strategy. By 1944, Japan's naval forces were increasingly relegated to defensive actions, and Japan's imperial ambitions were no longer feasible. The U.S., meanwhile, launched a series of successful amphibious operations that left Japan's remaining defenses vulnerable. The U.S. took key islands such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, inching ever closer to the Japanese home islands. With each passing battle, Japan's ability to resist became more and more limited. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, often called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was another critical blow to Japan's naval power. The battle saw the Japanese Navy suffer devastating losses in both aircraft and experienced pilots. Japan's remaining aircraft carriers were severely damaged, and by the end of the battle, Japan had lost nearly all of its remaining carrier-based aircraft. The loss of these carriers further weakened Japan's ability to contest U.S. operations in the Pacific. By this point, Japan's naval strategy had shifted to one of desperation. The Japanese Navy increasingly relied on kamikaze tactics, suicide attacks by pilots crashing into Allied ships in an attempt to inflict as much damage as possible. While these attacks were often devastating, they were also a sign of Japan's dwindling resources and the hopelessness of their situation. As Japan's naval forces continued to crumble, so too did the morale of its military. The realization that victory was no longer possible, combined with the horrific casualties suffered in battles like the Battle of Leyte Gulf and Iwo Jima, led many in the Japanese military to question the direction of the war. Despite these doubts, the leadership in Tokyo continued to push for a fight to the last man, resulting in unnecessary losses of both military personnel and civilians. On the home front, Japan's industrial capacity was in full mobilization. However, the country's ability to produce new ships and aircraft had been severely hampered by continuous Allied air raids, which targeted Japan's factories, infrastructure, and transport networks. By 1945, Japan's war industry was in shambles, unable to replace the fleet that had once dominated the Pacific. As the United States closed in on the Japanese home islands, Japan's naval and air forces were reduced to defending their homeland. The once proud Imperial Japanese Navy, which had been a symbol of Japan's strength and expansion, was now a shadow of its former self. The loss of experienced officers, pilots, and warships had crippled Japan's ability to defend itself. The ultimate demise of the Japanese Imperial Navy was sealed with the defeat of the Japanese forces at Okinawa in June 1945. This battle, which involved one of the bloodiest ground campaigns of the war, provided the Allies with a launching point for the eventual invasion of Japan. The loss of Okinawa was the final blow to Japan's ability to defend its homeland, and the Japanese Navy had little left to offer in terms of resistance. In the closing months of the war, Japan's leadership continued to refuse to surrender, despite the growing realization that the war was lost. The Japanese military leadership, including remnants of the Imperial Navy, clung to the hope that they could make a last stand against the advancing Allied forces. However, with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Japan's resistance finally crumbled. The end of the war marked the official dissolution of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a once mighty force that had ruled the Pacific for much of the early years of World War II. The Navy's collapse was a symbol of Japan's overall defeat and the end of its expansionist ambitions.